Hello and welcome. Right, today we're going to look at race discrimination and a bit of a theory, in the area. This would, help us see how groups of people can be discriminated against on the basis of their race, and then we will also look at some of the, laws that we have in this area. All right, so I'm going to share my screen now. All right, so we're going to be looking at race discrimination. Right, so from our previous discussion, we agreed that discrimination is an unjust or an unequal treatment of individuals based on their membership of a social group. Race discrimination, therefore, is when a person is treated unjustly or unequally because they are of a particular race or ethnicity. And then race discrimination can have a long-term adverse impact on members of a group and can affect people's health and mental well-being. Persistent exposure to discrimination, can lead individuals to internalize prejudice and manifest them in, shame, fear, stress, or low self-esteem. Sometimes we find that, when people are consistently told that they are not good enough, in some cases, this may lead to low self-esteem. If you remember from our lecture on sex discrimination, we looked at the life course theory, where, we saw that, how discriminatory practices a child faced in childhood can affect them as an adult. So I believe, this would also be applicable under race. All right, so before I go any further, I just want to add a caveat. I'm still new in my research on race theory, so I don't claim to know everything about race or all the relevant factors involved in race research. In one of our previous seminars, we talked about privileges and advantages. I have a lot of that working in my favor, so I cannot fully, rely on my experiences to explain the experiences of someone else, who has lived all her life here. Right. However, I am researching and trying to fully understand it. And because, I want to give you the theory as an introduction to the legislation, that's why I must, touch on it today. All right. So, so it has been recognized that races do not exist in any scientifically meaningful sense. All right. So this, race was a creation of a society, to justify the mistreatment and exclusion of minority groups. And this dates back to the Spanish Inquisition of the 15th century. It has been established that there is nothing like a pure race, okay? And this has also been scientifically proven. So like gender, race is a social construct based on real or perceived biological differences. So remember, in gender, society, looks at the biological or physical characteristics of a baby and classify him or her either as a boy or a girl. Okay, so this is the same in race. Society looks at the physical characteristic of a person and classify them as belonging to a particular race or ethnicity. All right, so they will look at what does the person look like, what does their hair look like, or the texture of their hair, what of their skin color, which country of what is their country of origin or the region of the world that they have come from. All right, so they look at all this and then would place a person in a race category. All right, so classifying race and ethnicity, concentrated on the use of variables such as skin color, country of origin, religion, nationality, and language, and so on. Okay, so Miles, in his research, says that that race is an analytical category, right? So that's an assumption, made about an individual or a group. Okay, unlike gender, he says that race should be dispensed with. This is because, when we use the term race, it legitimizes the distinction we make about people, and then go on to perpetuate the notion that race is a meaningful term. Then Antheus, on the other hand, does not think that we should deny the significance of race, because if we do, it will obscure the ways in which race has real effects on people, all right, both in material and representational terms, because whether we like it or not, race has an effect on the groups that have been racialized. All right, so if we consider that a particular racial group is dangerous, people tend to fear them. And obviously this will have an impact, on the group. All right, so that's why Antheus thinks that, we should not deny the significance of race. All right, so let's look at, the definition here. All right, so I have asked, is there any distinction between race and ethnicity? All right, so in Anthea's writing, so race has been defined in biological terms and sharing of a common origin. All right, so a person can be categorized based on what they look like or their origin. Okay, so for example, a person can be categorized as Jewish because of their origin. All right, then it has also been, race has also been expressed in terms of geography of a population, with genetically transmitted physical characteristics. All right, so a person can be categorized based on where the people that look like that are usually found. Okay, so for example, we can call a group of people Asians because of where they're from, the region that they are from, and then that they have certain similar characteristics in common. And then race can also be in terms of a group of people that are united or classified together on the basis of sharing a common history, nationality, or geographic distribution. Okay, so for example, Sikhs share a common history and nationality. All right, so these are ways that race can be classified. Then Antheus described ethnicity as the identification of particular cultures as ways of life or identity, which are based on a historical notion of origin, whether mythical or real. All right, so people have been grouped according to their race, then their ethnicity is then used to identify them, by their way of life, their tradition, their language, culture, beliefs, etc. All right, so when people are grouped and classified based on their race and ethnicity, race then becomes a tool used to interpret a person's behavior, based on their physical characteristic. All right, so that's why you see situations where, say, for example, a person may be identified as an Indian woman, okay, and then there are beliefs that Indian women are forced into marriages. All right, so you find that these two then sort of get merged together, and then an assumption will be made about this Indian woman who may not even be considering marriage. All right, but this assumption is made because she has been identified as an Indian woman, and it is believed that they have these practices of forced marriages. Okay, so that identifying her race has now been used as a tool to explain, certain behaviors. All right, so this case about the Indian woman, I have a case on it, all right, which we'd look at in another lecture. All right, so this is what classification, based on race and ethnicity does. Okay, and it can cause individuals, to treat other people unfairly or unjustly based on the notions that they have about that race. Okay, and it's not only individuals that do this. All right, so we find that governments and institutions, do this as well. And then when they do that, it can have a negative impact on minorities, in the access that they may be allowed to certain resources available. Okay, they can also be politically and economically exploited and denied opportunities or benefits that are available to others. Okay, so we find that, they can also be excluded and marginalized. Okay, so this is when you now start hearing things like institutional discrimination. Right, so the dominant group can internalize, some of these prejudices about a minority, and then it can cause exclusion, of the minorities. Right, so we're going to look at, how discrimination can exclude, certain groups. All right, so barriers to inclusion. All right, so we have unconscious bias. All right, so this is a social stereotype, which individuals can hold about groups of people outside of their own consciousness. Right, so people may have a notion about a person because of their race, and then they react towards that person without actually realizing that they are doing it. Okay, and this can have an impact on different groups. Okay, it can have an impact on hiring. All right, so an employer, may have an unconscious bias towards a certain race, and then when they get an application from them, they may make a decision based on their bias. Okay, so this tends to contribute to disparities in groups, where you find more people of a certain race that are more likely to be in employment than another group. Okay, there was a social experiment conducted in the US and Europe or EU, and it shows that the applicants with their white sounding names are 5 times more likely to be called for interviews than applicants with ethnic minority sounding names. And these applicants have the same qualification and experience. Okay, so this is what some of these categorization, which may cause unconscious bias, can cause. Then we also have segregation. Okay, so discrimination can also cause a segregation in the job market. Okay, where people are segregated. I think we looked at this in sex discrimination as well. You find a certain groups of people in the top positions and certain groups in lower positions. Okay, so this also happens in race. Many migrant workers are found to be separated into low-skilled jobs. And then there was a 2006 statistics from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which showed that skilled migrants, had a lower rates of employment than skilled migrants. Okay, then we have institutional discrimination. Okay, so this is discrimination carried out systematically by institutions such as government, schools, and businesses. All right, so these institutions may have policies that are part of the organization. However, these policies may create and perpetuate a disadvantage, for racialized groups. All right, so just like in gender, organizational cultures may also perpetuate disadvantages. So, for example, the managers or senior managers, may employ through networks, okay, and then the managers may likely recommend their friends, okay, who may be people that look like them, okay, and they may also want to, employ people that they feel that they can understand, okay, so yeah, so that's it for institutional discrimination. Then there are also informal barriers, and these are more subtle and not easily detected. Okay, they can affect people's opportunities as well. All right, so let's consider how informal barriers can play out. Okay, so we have the case of ESOP and others against the Home Office. All right, so in that case, Mr. Esop is the lead appellant in a group of 49 people. Okay, and 6 of them were chosen as test cases. They are or were all employed by the Home Office. Okay, so they were required to pass a core skills assessment test, as a prerequisite to promotion to certain civil service grades. So this assessment, it was a generic test, okay, which was required irrespective of whichever role the applicants were, were applying for. Okay, so this test was used, to, they said it was required, so it was used to test the core skills, okay, to see if a person is it can be considered able to work for the civil service. Okay, it wasn't used to test knowledge and skills required for the post that these people have applied for. All right, so candidates who passed the test were then required to now sit and pass a specific test for the role that they have applied for. Okay, so all the appellants, at some point they had, failed this test and they were not eligible for promotion. Yeah, okay, so they were not eligible for promotion. Then there was a report, which was which the Home Office carried out, and it established that Black and minority ethnic groups, that's a BME, and older candidates, that they had a lower pass rates for that test when compared to white and younger candidates. Now, no one was able to identify why this was so. Nobody knew why they failed the test. Okay, but all they knew is that statistics show that BMEs and older candidates were more likely to fail that test than white candidates and younger candidates. So the these appellants they now issued their claims alleging that the requirement to pass that test constituted indirect discrimination on the grounds of race or age. All right, so you see how this is how a requirement, which may not be relevant to a job, can pose a barrier to a group of people. Okay, so there are various factors that can cause certain requirements to have an effect on the racial groups. Okay, I mean, it could be genetic, it could be social practices, okay, that can cause this. But like in this case, nobody knew what it was. Okay, nobody knew what it was, but all they knew is that there was statistics showing that a high proportion of BMEs and other candidates failed it. Okay, so these are sort of ways that barriers can stop certain groups from getting to whatever position or whatever benefits that are available. All right, so so apart from employment, there is also a disparity, found between groups in education, degree attainment, and degree outcomes. Okay, again, this has also been attributed to many factors. There is an attainment gap between BMEs and their white counterparts. Data shows that 73.8% of white students attained a first class or a 2-1 compared to 57% of BMEs. This also happens even where BMEs have better A-level results than their white counterparts. And then when they graduate with the same degrees as their white counterparts, they fare worse in the labor market. Okay, ethnicity factors, appear to be instrumental in increasing the likelihood that graduates will experience unemployment or go into non-graduate jobs. Then educational characteristics, have not been able to explain ethnic group differences in graduation outcomes. Okay, graduates from most minority groups have a higher chance of unemployment than white graduates. All right. Again, like I said, it has been a combination of many factors. Okay, so this could be some of the things I mentioned above. Unconscious bias in recruitment, institutional discrimination, or it could also be outright discrimination. All right, so this is why, whatever it is, we need laws and strategies, to help eliminate these inequalities and give these groups, a better chance, to, get the jobs and, fare well in the labor market. All right, so that's it for theory. And so we'll just go on to look at some of the laws we have under race discrimination. So we're not looking at everything here, right? Because when we look at Equality Act, then we look at them in more detail. All right, so the first directive aimed at tackling race discrimination was adopted in 2000. Right, so it laid down a framework for combating discrimination on grounds of racial or ethnic origin, with a view of putting into effect, equal treatment. The directive prohibits direct discrimination, indirect discrimination, harassment, and victimization on the grounds of racial or ethnic origins. All right, so we just, for today, we'll just look at direct and indirect discrimination. All right, so we have the Equality Act of 2010. All right, so Section 4 of the Act, lists race as one of the protected characteristics. All right, so therefore, discrimination on the basis of race is unlawful. All right, then race is defined in Section 9 of the Equality Act, and it includes color, nationality, and ethnic or national origins. All right, so this section says that, a reference to a person sharing one of these characteristics with others is a reference to a racial group. Okay, and then it says that the fact that a racial group comprises two or more distinct racial group does not prevent it from constituting a racial group. All right, so in previous legislation, racial grounds was used, okay, as against Equality Act, which says because of, so discrimination because of, all right, but in previous legislation, the term that was used was racial grounds, okay, and the definition includes ethnic or national origin. All right, so when we define origin, we usually focus on descent. Okay, so where the person descended from. Then the use of racial grounds has a wide scope of protection, and it makes it possible for a person to be treated on racial grounds, even if the claimant, is not a member of that racial group. All right, so this can be seen in the case of Wethersfield and Sargent, where in that case, Mrs. Sargent, she got a job at Wethersfield. Wethersfield is a car hire company. All right, so she was told on the day she resumed, she was told that they had a policy regarding colored and Asians. Okay, and that they have to be careful who they hire their vehicles to. All right, so they told her that if she gets a phone call from any of them, she could tell them from their voices, right? So if she gets a phone call from them, she should tell them that there were no vehicles available. All right, so she was appalled by this and she resigned. Okay, she brought a claim for constructive unfair dismissal, for race discrimination. And the court held that, though she was not colored or Asian, okay, that her employer's conduct was on racial grounds. All right, therefore, she was discriminated against because of her race. Okay, so even though she was a white woman, all right, so she wasn't colored or Asian, all right, but it was held that the discrimination was on the basis of race, okay, because it was on racial grounds. Okay, then that expression on racial grounds does not cover every case in which the discriminator's act was significantly influenced, by racial considerations. Okay, even if the race, was that of a third party. All right, so we have Redfern and Seco. All right, so this in this case, an employer discovered that one of their bus drivers was a candidate for a councillor for the British National Party. So they decided to dismiss him on health and safety grounds because a significant number of their passengers were of Asian origin. So the tribunal held that the bus driver was not discriminated against on racial grounds. Okay. All right, then we have, so nationality, is also included in definition of race. All right, so nationality is the, is the legal relations between a person and a state, all right, resulting from either being born in that state or by naturalization. Then we also have national origins, listed there as well. All right, so this is the place from which a person originates. All right, so they must have some identifiable elements, and this could be historic or geographic. All right, so for example, we have English and Scots. Okay, they have different national origins, even though they are both British citizens. Okay, but they are of different national origins. So we have the case of BBC and Sosta. All right, so in that case, an English journalist on BBC Scotland, he claimed that he was replaced by a Scotswoman, because, he was English. Then the Court of Session held that, that this was capable of constituting a discrimination on grounds of national origin. All right, and that, nationality does not need to be defined in terms of citizenship. All right, so you find that English, Scots, and Welsh, okay, they can be defined as having the same nationality as citizens of UK, all right, but they have different national origins. Okay, so a Scots person or a Welsh person, can bring a claim on national origin. Okay, so national origins, refers only to a particular place or country of origin. Okay, so national origins means national in the sense of a race and not citizenship. All right, so it was held in that case, it was held that there was no discrimination on grounds of national origins, where the complainant was treated less favorably on grounds that he had been born abroad. Okay, in that case, Tijani against the superintendent registrar for the district of Peterborough. All right, so in that case, the district registrar, required to see the passport of any person who had been born abroad or had lived abroad before he could issue out a marriage license, and it was held not to be unlawful discrimination. All right, but the Court of Appeal, stated that it would have been unlawful discrimination under the Act if, say, for instance, only colored migrants, had been required to produce a passport. Okay, but this was, something general. If you're born abroad or you've lived abroad, you have to produce a passport, before they can issue you a marriage license. All right, so it wasn't directed at anybody in particular. Then ethnicity is also included in the definition of race. So a group can be defined by reference to its ethnic origins. Okay, so by reference to ethnic origin, if it constitutes a separate and distinct community, by virtue of the characteristics which they are, that race is commonly associated with. All right, so this was established in Mandla and Dowell Lee. All right, so in this case, it was a case of a schoolboy. He was a Sikh. The school refused to change its uniform policy, to allow the wearing of turbans, and because of this, this Sikh boy, he was prevented from applying to join that school. And his father also wanted to raise him a practicing Sikh, right? So he needed him, to have that turban on. All right. This case was it was a 1982 case, and at the time, religious discrimination was not prohibited. All right. So they had to bring the case as a race discrimination case. All right. So in order for race discrimination to be established, it was necessary for Sikhs, to be identified as a racial group. All right. So the argument in court, centered on whether, Sikhs were, whether they were an ethnic ethnic group or not. Okay, and the House of Lord, decided that there were a number of conditions that a group has to satisfy before it can call itself an ethnic group. All right, so these are the conditions that have to be met before a group can be considered an ethnic group. And this was given by Lord Fraser. Okay, so he says that it is essential that the group has a long shared history. Okay, so of which that group is conscious, and that this will distinguish them from other groups. Okay, and then so that they have to have a long shared history. And then the second one, that they have to have a cultural tradition of its own. Okay, so this can include family and social customs and manners, but not necessarily associated to religious observance. Then they also have to either have a common geographical origin or a descent from a small number of common ancestors. Then the next one, that they have to have a common language. All right, but that language is not does not necessarily have to be peculiar to that group. Then they also have to have a common literature, peculiar to the group. They also have to have a common religion, that is different from their neighboring groups, or from that of general community, around it. Then they have to also be a minority. Okay, so if a group are able to establish this, then they can be regarded as an ethnic group. Okay, so such groups, they could include converts to that group, or those married into it. Okay, so it is possible for a person to become a member of a racial group defined by reference to origin, through birth, adherence, or by marriage. All right, so from this, it means that, it is more cultural than it is scientific or biological. Okay, if there is a recognizable racial or ethnic group, which has a group characteristic, then they may, still be classed as a racial group. Okay, as long as they meet those criteria. All right, so it doesn't matter if that group has become assimilated into the general public. Okay, as long as they can still be distinguished from the rest of the population, based on the things, the criteria that the House of Lords has listed. Okay, so an example of this, we can see example of this, the Romani gypsies or travelers. Okay, I learned, that a lot of them, don't travel anymore, and that they're beginning to settle, within communities. All right, so even though they are settling and assimilating in the communities, they are still an ethnic group. Okay, and they are protected under the race discrimination law. All right, so we have that case, CRE, which is a Commission for Racial Equality, against Dutton. All right, so in the case, they had a sign on their windows that said, "Sorry, no travelers." Okay, and the Racial Equality Commission, felt that this discriminated against gypsies. Okay, because they are more likely to be the ones traveling rather than more likely to be travelers rather than the people in the community. And then the county judge, found that gypsies did not constitute a racial group. Okay, and then this was appealed, and this, the appeal court upheld the findings. But then this was then further appealed to the Court of Appeal. Okay, and the Court of Appeal concluded that gypsies were an identifiable group of persons defined by reference to ethnic origins, within the Act. All right, so this was race discrimination against them. Okay, by preventing them from, entering using the services of the pub. All right. Right. So the court in Mandla, held that Sikhs formed a racial group because of their ethnic origin. Right, and it did not matter that they were not biologically distinguishable from other people living in Punjab. Then in Sierra against Dutton, it was said that using the word gypsies as a wandering race of Hindu origin, that they are an identifiable group of they were identifiable group defined by reference to their ethnic group, within the meaning of racial group. All right. From what I've read, Romani people originated from the Indian subcontinent, and they arrived in Europe, in the 11th century. So this is a very, very long shared history. Okay, and obviously this falls within the criteria identified, by the House of Lords in Mandla. And then we have Rastafarians, which originated in Jamaica in the 1930s. Okay, and it has been held that they do not fall within the definition of ethnic origin. Okay, because they do not have a long shared history or group history of their own. Okay, as compared to the Romani people. Yeah, as compared to the Romani people, because they originated, this was like in the 11th century, all right, but this Rastafarians is just in the 1930s, all right, so they don't have a long enough shared history to fall under that criteria. In the case, that Dawkins case, it was an applicant, he was turned away. He was denied a job because, they required him. Rastafarians obviously have dreads and dreadlocks. Okay, so the job, required him to have a short hair. Okay, and he refused to cut it, and because of that, they denied him the job. Okay. All right, so the Court of Appeal, said that Rastafarians could not be defined as a racial group, and they did not fulfill the criteria. Okay, that was laid down. However, this Dawkins case, was heard in 1993. Okay, so this was before religious discrimination, was outlawed in 2003. Okay, so I think now Rastafarians can bring a claim under religious discrimination. Okay, because it is also a religion, right? So they have not been classed as an ethnic group, but they are a religion. Okay, so they can bring a claim for religious discrimination. Okay, so so neither the English or the Scots are an ethnic group. Okay, because the distinctive racial element that is required for recognition as an ethnic group is lacking. All right. But again, like I said, they can come under national origins. As we saw in that case, BBC Scotland against Ulster. Okay, and then just like Sikhs, which is a religion, as well as a racial group. Okay, so when we say someone is a Jewish, it can also mean that they're a member of a race or ethnic group, as well as a member of a religious group. Okay, so that's it for definition of race under the law. Okay, so which includes color, ethnic origin, national origin, and nationality. All right, so we now go to look at direct race discrimination and indirect race discrimination. All right, so direct race discrimination is when a person has been treated less favorably because of their race. All right, so where a person acts because of race or on racial grounds as used in previous legislation, the reason why he does so is irrelevant. Okay, so in other words, motive is irrelevant in direct race discrimination. Whereas I have a case there, a European Human Rights Center against the immigration officer at Prague Airport. All right, so in this case, British immigration officials pre-cleared passengers from Czech Republic. Now, so if the officers concluded that the passenger would claim asylum once they arrived, then they would refuse them entry. All right, so the Roma people were deliberately intensively questioned, because the officers, they knew that practically all Czech asylum seekers were Roma. All right, so the court, held that the system was inherently and systematically discriminatory on racial grounds. All right, so it was not legitimate to apply a stereotype and then commence with the assumption that applicants from Roma, may be making false claims. Okay, and that for that reason, their claims, require more intensive investigation. All right, so this would be, race discrimination directed at Roma people. Okay, because this was just targeted at them. They are questioned intensively, to see if whether they were lying or whatever. So any suspicion, they would deny them their application. All right, so this was targeted at them. Okay, right in statutory comparison. Right, so direct discrimination cases require a statutory comparison, because of the demand for less favorable treatment. Okay, so it means that a person, needs to compare their treatment with that given to another person, in order to establish that they were treated less than that other. All right, so the comparison will be, with a person of a particular racial group with a person, that is not of that racial group. All right, so we have this case, that against McDonald's hamburgers. All right, so in that case, Mr. Dat is an Indian with an Indian nationality. He came to the UK when he was 6 years old and has indefinite leave to enter. All right, so having that that type of visa does not require a work permit to work. All right, so he was employed and he was asked to produce a work permit. Okay, he didn't produce one and he was dismissed. Now, on the application form, it asked, if you are not a British citizen or from the EEC, do you have a permit to work in Britain? Okay, so the applicant, he claimed, Mr. Data claimed that his treatment as an Indian citizen, had to be compared with that's given to other applicants, who were not Indian citizens, including British citizens and EEC nationals. All right, but the Court of Appeal held that that the ET, that's the Employment Tribunal and the Employment Appeal Tribunal, had correctly found that the respondent employers had not discriminated against him on grounds of his nationality. Okay, by asking him, to produce evidence of his rights to work in the UK, when they did not make similar demands to those who were British and EEC citizens. All right, so to carry out a comparison, so to carry out a comparison, what is needed is, like for like comparison. Okay, so therefore there must not be a material differences between him and his comparator. Okay, so he cannot compare himself, with British citizens or EEC citizens. All right, he should compare himself with people who are not of Indian origin or Indian nationality and require a work permit. All right, so when we compare this like for like, okay, then we can see that he was not treated less favorably because another person, with a different nationality who requires a work permit would also be asked to produce it. Okay, so it wasn't anything to do with with his nationality. Okay, it was about him having the work permit. Okay. Right, so this is how comparison works. All right, though asking him for a work permit, is discriminatory in itself. Okay, because they are making a distinction, between people based on their nationality. And this is what discrimination law is trying to stop. Okay, they try to stop distinction, based on any of the listed characteristics. However, this discrimination was sanctioned by statute. Okay, so the law demands that an employer, must see a work permit before they allow a worker to work. Okay, I want us to distinguish this from the case of James and Eastleigh. Okay, so James and Eastleigh, we will be looking at that on that direct discrimination. Okay, but I want to distinguish it from that. Now, in James and Eastleigh, it was about a man, a husband, and his wife. They were both 60 years old. Okay, and they went to use the council's swimming pool. Now, the council gave pensioners a concession and allowed them to use the swimming pool for free. They did that as a way to help pensioners who were, on less income. All right. So at this time, women retired at 60. All right, and men retired at 65. All right. So this meant that Mr. James' wife had retired and he was still working. Okay. So because of that, his wife was allowed in, and he was denied entry unless he paid. And then he brought a claim for sex discrimination. Now the council, claimed that they set this policy, on attainment of pensionable age. But the court found that, no, this was a discrimination on the basis of sex. All right. So the difference between these two cases is that in James, okay, the council was not mandated by government to use that pension criteria. They chose, the criteria was discriminatory, okay, but they chose it of their own free will. All right, but if the government had said that all councils must use pensionable criteria to give pensions, okay, and then they use that, then they can, escape liability, by saying, look, the government mandated this. All right, and that's the same thing with in that case. All right, the employers, they had the responsibility to ensure that applicants were lawfully entitled to work. All right, Parliament has made a division between those who by reason of their nationality are free to work and those who require a work permit. All right, so the employers had to ask for the work permit. Okay, so even though it was discriminatory on the basis of their nationality, but it was mandated by the government. Okay, so in that case, they had to escape liability. All right, then we have indirect race discrimination. All right, so so indirect race discrimination is where a policy or criterion or practice, okay, puts a group at a disadvantage because of their race. All right, so say for instance, an employer may have a policy that they use at work, or a practice or a criteria, whatever it is, that they have at work, and then it puts a group, one of the protected groups, at a disadvantage. All right, then we'll have that case, Osborne Clark Services against Purohit. Okay, so an employer, in that case, an employer had a policy of not considering any application for solicitor training contract, from people who need permission from the Border and Immigration Agency to work in the UK. All right, so they just had this blanket policy not to consider the application without even trying to apply for work permit for them. All right, so this was held, to have a disproportionate impact on non-EEA nationals. All right, so and then they couldn't, they did not have any objective reason, for having that, so therefore they couldn't justify it. All right, and the policy actually put those groups at a disadvantage. Then we have the code of practice on racial inequality and employment, which makes it clear that as far as possible, selection should be based purely on merit, okay, and that work permit issues should come into consideration at a later stage of selection. Okay, so it also makes it clear that as far as possible, that employers should make an application and leave it up to the immigration authorities to determine the outcome. Right? They can't just not consider people's application. People that are not from the UK or the EU, they cannot just not consider the application Okay, it's up to the government to decide who would work in the country or not, and not the employer. All right, then we look at discrimination by employers. Okay, so employers, they can discriminate. Okay, so it may be due to unconscious bias that I mentioned, or it could be something else. Okay, it could be outright discrimination or whatever it is. All right, so and it can be difficult to measure the suitability of candidates objectively. Okay, and it often requires subjective judgments made by an employer. All right, so because of this, it can be difficult to determine that a person has been discriminated against. All right, so the courts would usually look to any evidence that would help them make a determination. Then we have the case of West Midlands Passenger Transport Executive against Singh. All right, so it was said that in that case it was said that the evidence that shows that a membership of a particular racial group, that they have a high percentage rate of failure to achieve a promotion may indicate that the real reason may be a conscious or unconscious racial attitudes towards them. Okay, so maybe so if an evidence is showing, if a statistics is showing that a lot of people of a racial group are not being promoted, then that could suggest that there is a discrimination. All right, so statistical evidence may be used to establish a pattern of a pattern in the treatment of a discrimination against a particular group. Then in Mecca Leisure Group against the Shatprachong, in that case, the court held that the employer, did not discriminate against an Asian-born employee on the grounds of race. The employer did not provide him with an English language training in order to prepare him for promotion. Okay, but there was no evidence to show, that the employer would give a special speech training to any member of their staff who was not of Asian origin. All right, so discrimination requires a like-for-like comparison. Okay, so they have to compare the person that is bringing the claim and their group, and how the employer will treat somebody that is in similar position as them. Okay, so it requires a like-for-like comparison. All right, and so this that's it for race discrimination. I have given you a detailed description of what race is and how people of a racial group are protected under the law. All right, so under the law, it defines race to include a certain characteristics. So color, ethnic origin, national origin, and nationality. Okay, so that's how race is defined. So anybody that falls within any of those characteristics can bring a claim, for race discrimination if they have been discriminated against on the basis of their race. Okay, and then their treatment has to be compared with the treatment given to others who are not of that same race, to establish discrimination. Okay, and then these are the laws. So we have under the Equality Act, we have direct discrimination and indirect discrimination. Okay, and direct is where a person has been treated less favorably than another because of their race, and then indirect is when they have a policy in place and it puts a certain group at a disadvantage. All right, so that's it, and I hope to see you in the seminar. Right, bye.